All right, this week, the Family Research Council, along with the organization Do No Harm and the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, published the Trans Youth Phenomenon, Critiques and Hard Questions. This new report addresses the difficult questions concerning the ideological underpinnings of the gender transitioning of minors, the physiological procedures currently being employed on minors, the ability of minors to consent, and the deficient justifications for increasingly intensive interventions. And it's an excellent resource for anyone looking for guidance on this important subject. Joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Jennifer Bauwens, Director of the Center for Family Studies here at the Family Research Council. Dr. Bauwens, welcome back to Washington Watch.
It's good to be back, Tony.
So tell us about this new publication and why it is so necessary at this time.
Yeah, so this resource is intended to be kind of for policymakers, first of all, because a lot of the testimonies that we've given at the state level or even up on the Hill have been the questions have that we've answered have been about these issues. So we put this together because we just kept hearing these questions over and over, and these are the issues that scaffold the trans issue, and the research that's used to come alongside and push these very invasive physiological interventions. So this is a great resource because it includes a lot of citations, a lot of the research that has been used to promote these procedures. So it's all in one place. Pretty much every question that's been asked on this issue is included in this packet here.
So who is this targeted toward in terms of who benefits most from having access to this publication?
So really, we wrote this with the intention that this would be used for policymakers, but it's so user-friendly that it is really for anyone who has questions. Or, maybe you're a parent or a grandparent and you have a child that you care about who's come home from school and they're giving some of the same lines that we often hear that, if I don't transition, I'm going to commit suicide. Or, what are some of the root issues that go along with someone who claims to be transgender? So we talk about the social contagion factor. And then we also talk about some of the things that maybe if you've been following this issue, some of the arguments or the logic that hasn't been presented in some of the public forums. For example, I speak a little bit about the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. And I look at the gender dysphoria diagnosis and compare it to other diagnoses that are listed in the DSM that would be for children and how we approach a diagnosis for children and how gender dysphoria is different. And these aren't necessarily hard factual things, but just things to say, hey, there's a little bit of a difference in how we approach gender dysphoria, and why is that the case? So it's a thought-provoking document as well as providing some real counters to the arguments that have been proposed in the psychological and medical fields.
So let me ask you about that, Dr. Bauwens. Give me two ways in which gender dysphoria is treated differently than some other disorder.
Yeah, so there's a class of disorders in the DSM that specifically are given when a person has a long pattern of behavior or thought. And typically when we're working with a child, we don't want to diagnose them until they're 18. And why is that? Well, we know that the child is still developing and they're still changing. And so you want to wait until their brain and their development has reached a certain marker. And so when they've reached that marker, then we kind of go back and say, let's look at this, and maybe they do in fact have this disorder. But what you have with gender dysphoria is somebody receiving a diagnosis within 6 months, before they're 18, before they've completed development. And then when you compare these types of diagnoses and the interventions attached to them, what you find is that gender dysphoria has a far more invasive, and actually more invasive than any other diagnosis in the DSM. So not only are we diagnosing early with something that would be considered a lifelong enduring pattern, but we're also attaching interventions that are really dangerous and life-altering while a person's still a child.
So when you're talking about these invasive, we're talking about surgeries and irreversible treatments?
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about making alterations to one's physiology that are irreparable, and certainly we don't even know the psychological ramifications of these interventions. And that hasn't been studied.
You touched on this. One of the reasons that we wait until a child reaches adulthood into a certain age is because well into adulthood, the brain is continuing to develop. So for a adolescent to be able to make a decision that is going to have effects upon their life for the rest of their life, that's not something that we've historically allowed in this country.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why we don't give diagnoses that are in the DSM that are heavier diagnoses that indicate someone has a lifelong pattern until they're 18. So then it's out of character, so to speak, to give a child such a heavy diagnosis that says this is how you'll always identify.
Is a 2 or 3 year phase, is that a lifelong pattern?
Not when you're a child.
Right.
I mean, think about how many of us, I myself thought I'd be an astronaut for several years. But I was influenced greatly by Star Wars. Now, I'm not an astronaut.
I thought I'd be a radio talk show host when I was a kid. Look what happened.
Look what happened. So some patterns are enduring, but it's better to wait until a person reaches adulthood to make those lifelong decisions.
So we see the differences there. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Why? Why? Why do we treat this different than any other condition?
Well, I think there are many factors, but I think for our purposes today, one that's worth noting is the political factor. And even trans advocates, I'll get that out, they actually can get upset with the U.S. and our use of gender dysphoria in the DSM, because a lot of activists believe that this is a civil rights issue and that it shouldn't be treated as a clinical issue. But they will say, especially those from other countries, will make comments that America has to for insurance purposes. So, what you see in the activist space is a lot of times using the DSM for the purposes, the end goal of transitioning or imposing these medical interventions on children when it's convenient. And that's not to say that there isn't a real issue that some kids suffer, but to divorce this idea from politics would be equally wrong and not paint a clear picture of what's going on in politics and the DSM.
So in this publication, The Trans Youth Phenomenon, Critiques and Hard Questions, Dr. Bauwens, you and your co-authors seek to kind of cut through the political and take us to the fact-based evidence that is behind this issue so that policymakers, parents, and others will know how to deal with it. That's right. That's the purpose of this document. All right. And where can folks get a copy besides TonyPerkins.com? At frc.org. It's on the main homepage. All right. Once again, great work, Dr. Bauwens. Always great to have you on the program, and glad you're at the Family Research Council.